Hello and welcome to another episode of Forward Thinking. I'm your guest host, Natalie Hazen, President and Founder at Raison d'Art. Today, I'm thrilled to host a conversation on data and the arts in Canada, a new kind of discussion for this series. I'm joined today by three incredible experts: strategist, founder and president of Strategic Moves, Inga Petry; arts consultant and director of Arts BC, Elliot Hart; and arts and governance consultant, president emerita at OCAD University, Sarah Diamond. Welcome all. So excited to have this conversation today with an expert panel on arts and data in Canada. And we're just going to dive right into data to begin with, sometimes known as a black box for arts and culture industries. So my first question for my expert panel today is, what technology tools are best suited to mobilize data in the arts and culture industries? Sarah, would you like to go?
Yeah, so I will confess that I think, as all three of us, I work in this space. I work between machine learning and AI, artificial intelligence sometimes, and also very much working with visualization. That's my research expertise. And, I think that there's also sort of basic data analytics tools that are, really helpful. But for me, the question is, what are the goals of using data analytics tools in order to support arts and culture, both not-for-profit and cultural industries? And then you don't start with the tools. You start with, what do we need to analyze? What is the data that we need to find? How do we find it? And then what are the appropriate tools to use? So I'll just give a very fast example. I worked a number of years ago, it was in 2016, 17, feels like an eon ago, on a project which was called Redefining Public Art in Toronto. I worked with my colleague Dan Silver at U of T and a horde of our students and his students and researchers. And we basically used some very basic AI-based natural language processing tools to look at trends in the ways that public art was understood over about a 50-year cycle in a lot of cities, right? So those tools were really helpful because we were actually able to confirm some of what we empirically thought, which was that the definition had expanded, temporality, i.e. do you do monuments or short-term works, had expanded, the kinds of artists engaged had expanded, and the way public art was understood within policy discourse had significantly changed. It saved us a lot of time to be able to use these tools in efficient ways. So that's an example. So maybe I'll just pause there because I think we're obviously going to talk about bias in this space and the problem with data sets and data provenance and all of that good stuff. But I think it always has to be purpose-driven. That's how we use data analysis, and we use specific tools for specific purposes.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that great example. I see that Elliot wants to jump in here and certainly has something interesting to say.
Yeah, for sure. I'll jump in. First of all, absolutely, Sarah, I agree. What are we using this for? What information are we actually looking for, and what are we going to do with it? And I think that's absolutely the most important piece. I've been really excited to see a shift to more qualitative data collection recently. So not just like audience analytics, which is of course super important and very, very useful, but I think the data that we're collecting now around experience and emotional response and kind of that connection again to well-being and quality of life is really, really interesting. And so the federal government in Canada is now kind of following some of the other countries that we've seen doing this work, particularly in the UK, right? So I think that really analyzing that connection between creative activity and consumption of arts and culture, and that connection to wellness and health and healthy communities and society and quality of life, I think that's very, very interesting, right? We're looking at that social impact of the arts. So that shift has been very interesting to me.
Elliot, I find it fascinating that you bring up qualitative data when you're talking about arts-based research. Can you explain a little bit more, maybe give an example of what that can look like?
Well, something that they're doing in the UK, I think, is quite interesting, where they've created these apps so that folks can really respond to art when they, for example, if they're in the gallery, they can give their emotional response. They can say what that experience was. And so collecting that data is really very interesting, and it helps us understand the sort of public reaction to the art that is being presented, which I think is very interesting, and being able to track trends. Which again, this goes back to what Sarah was saying about what we think of as art and what our policies need to be around public art and so on. So
that I would love to be in front of that and that data, to be able to sort of glean like how people react and see and sort of see it as a trigger as somebody's moving through a museum or something, or a gallery in that way. Inga, do you have something to add to the conversation?
No, for sure. There is an assumption whenever we talk about data that what we measure actually counts, that what we measure actually matters. And I think Elliot and Sarah are both doing work in that arena as well, where there has been a very facile story for arts and culture around economic impact. That is actually not particularly helpful. We're dealing with a sector where we might have 17 volunteers for every staff person. Those 17 volunteers actually generate economic impact that is never measured, right? So I think we have to be very thoughtful. We've had an example recently where the Conference Board of Canada with the Cultural Human Resources Council are trying to do a labor force study. And that's fantastic if you're in the provinces. The numbers that they came up with for the North were absolutely useless. They did not reflect our reality. They are undercounting the number of artists massively. If you look at the cultural satellite account, for instance, you believe that there might be about 400 artists in Nunavut. If you ask the Nunavut government and what they're counting, it's 4,000. Right. So you see in some areas of the country, I live in Whitehorse, Yukon. I'm keenly attuned to what happens in remote and rural communities across this country, and how the kind of counting we're doing is in fact not showing us any kind of reality. It's a very small, thin slice. And there's impacts of that. It means that we're underestimating the value and impact of the arts and cultural activities in this country. It has impacts on sort of how do we evaluate health and wellness outcomes, which are intrinsic to much of the arts. And we're not really able to understand those properly. So we do need to think about how we're designing research, what kind of data we're actually collecting, and what we want to do with that. What I find is that in places like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, those errors come out in the wash. Those same errors exist, right? But they're not as significant than they are in a place where the entire North is 120,000 people in it, right? That's basically what Cabbagetown or something in Toronto.
That is a really interesting perspective. I'll get Sarah. I know that you want to jump in, so go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should keep this conversation going for a while because, qualitative research tends to get downplayed, but in fact, I think it also gets kind of misunderstood, and there's such a close relationship between qualitative and quantitative data. So I consider a lot of survey data to be qualitative data. And I'll just, give you an example. So La Placa Cohen is, very well known, I guess, for their surveys where they basically look at what audiences say they do, what they're interested in, what their consumption habits are. La Placa Cohen Business for the Arts and Nanos did a survey in 2017-18. And they define a panel. So a panel are the cohorts of people they're going out to ask questions for. And, they ask them questions like, what kind of culture do you consume? How do you feel in relationship to galleries, museums, festivals, libraries, etc.? And this is really subjective data. This is what people say they do. And I think that's very important work. It's then analyzed and the data is rolled up and we use it, in fact, to plan our organizations, et cetera. Been quite important during COVID-19, and we'll come to that. But it really is qualitative data, although gathered in large cohort. A very important survey that Kelly Hill undertook. I have a lot of respect for Hill Strategies. They do fantastic work in the cultural sector. And he looked at the 2016-17 census data that looked at what Canadians say, and these are people who are part of census, so there's already an exclusion of other demographics here. But what people say the correlation is between their engagement with arts and culture and their sense of health and well-being. And the findings are fantastic. Higher frequency of self-reported good or excellent health, higher frequency of excellent or good mental health. And there's a whole list here. It's actually very, very exciting. It still is what people say they do and say what they feel. So I'm very interested in large survey data that is really qualitative in so many ways, and then placing it against quantitative data where you measure in various ways what people actually do. And some of the works that Synapse is doing out of Montreal, the Data Ecoculture conference that we just had, but that work is about marrying the qualitative and the quantitative, and you can take the image off if you want. I think that is very exciting. And I think that's where also AI has a really valuable role to play, because you can also scrape social media data. You can get all kinds of opinion data from it, that helps to understand how a particular cultural product is received. And it builds on Elliot's, vision of people standing there with surveys asking questions as they leave. So I think the future is that mix. And Indigenous research right now, there's a huge focus on Indigenous methods of using, story circles and ways of engaging with communities, but also supplementing that with social media data, because Indigenous communities are some of the most active communities online. So for me, the future is this mix. I want to come back to the problem of data sets on the margins, because Inga really raised a big issue there, and that's where you can't just use AI and machine learning algorithms. They fail the margins always.
Yeah. And the margins are big in this country, right? It might only account for 20% of the population, but it's about 95% of our land mass, right? I think there is an interesting, sort of aspect to this, where there was a few years ago, the Wolf Brown and American company did a study called the Major University Presenter Study, MUPS. And they did exactly what, Sarah, you're describing. They asked the aspirational question, do you want to attend? Is this interesting to you? But they were also able to marry up that information with actual box office data. Mm-hmm. And what you see is exactly what you see if I've asked you if you voted in the last federal election, right? All of a sudden, our voter participation is 80%. We know that is not true. So the gap, right? And that gap, that 15 or 20% aspirational gap, means the success or failure of our arts organizations. What I say I do is what I mean to do, but it's not what I actually do, right? And that measuring that and understanding that better, from a sustainable and viability of arts organization standpoint is actually important. Now, we are saying this in a context, though, and part of our context is that most of the arts in Canada are not meant to be commercial. They're not a business in the sense of they must be self-sustaining due to free market forces. We, in fact, have a sort of framework that acknowledges that there is a lot more going on than just the economic story. And so, how do we place emphasis on the different kinds of research? I've spent 15 years doing audience research designed for the express purpose of increasing audiences. That is a very different thing than a project I had the privilege to do called The Value of Presenting, a study of performing arts presentation in Canada back in between 2011 and 2013, which had the express purpose of examining everything but economic impact. And, really looking at the individual, community, and societal impacts, looking at the health, wellness, increased rates of volunteering, looking at the exact same studies that, Hill Strategies has rolled up from Statistics Canada surveys, the General Social Survey. There are a lot of tools. Part of the challenge that I encounter in my work, though, is the narrative around the intrinsic impacts of the arts are very powerful, but hardly anybody designs their programs to achieve those.
That is so true. Inga, I'm really, really interested in that context that you're bringing up with regards to being inclusive and accessibility. And I'm wondering now, because we are in the middle of a pandemic, well, maybe hopefully not in the middle, but coming to the tail end, all fingers crossed. How do you see that changing with the pandemic? How do you see these factors and those gaps that we're talking about? How do you see them changing? And I'd like to hear Elliot's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah. I see two things happening at the same time. One is we've been in the rush to the internet and the rush to digital because of COVID, especially in the arts. All we've really seemed to have done in one way of thinking is to amplify all the things that aren't working well in the physical world. So the systemic exclusion of people in the north, of people in rural communities, artists in those places with very inadequate internet, trying to do live streaming from the house is not going to work. We've moved the sort of onus on production into individual artists' living rooms. Very, very difficult. And I think there are systemic exclusions that have simply been amplified. On the other hand, and some of these projects have, predate COVID, but their relevancy has really been heightened. On the other end of that are a number of projects that exist in the Canada, often funded by Canada Council now, which are really trying to grapple with digital justice. What does it mean to write an AI algorithm, which really, that is just big data, right? It's just a massive data set that, depending on how I use it, can either, amplify the biases from the real world, or it can begin to address them. So it's not a popularity contest I'm looking for. It's, which is how a lot of recommender engines work. It's really more about whose voices do I care to discover and amplify. And if I write an algorithm for diversity, I'm going to write a different algorithm than if I'm simply writing a popularity contest. So there are a number of projects in that realm as well that are very hopeful.
I think that's really, it encapsulates the goals that we've been focusing on with regards to data. And I'm going to go to Sarah now. Elliot, if you're okay with going after, that would be really wonderful.
I think it's been complex during COVID-19. I mean, I think that there has been some really phenomenal work on the part of artists in this case, including artists who are not necessarily at the center by any means. And I know that, Rebecca, you've got some of my slides, just a little bit later on in the story, but maybe it's helpful to look at that for a moment and, see what's sort of coming out of this environment, because in interesting ways, people have been able to reach much larger audiences than they have in the past, because we have gravitated online, and some of the work that organizations have undertaken has been to make, that work, really like far, far more accessible. So I don't know if you can pull up Brendan Fernandez's piece. I just wanted to give us a little bit of delight through visual pleasure, and then we can, we can come back to, what the challenges and issues are. But, Brendan, who's a phenomenal Canadian artist, he happens to be working out of Chicago these days, but, he did this project for the AGO that was commissioned as a physical performance. And what he ended up doing, which was, very, very successful, was to create this piece using essentially a Zoom space and this sort of fragmented ways that dancers were all interacting with each other. He's also begun to use mobile phones to call on dance choreographic moves from dancers who are dispersed in different kinds of locations, and then the audience can be online and watch that in real time. I think that kind of creativity is amazing, and he's a racialized artist. He's very aware of issues of inclusion and engagement, and also alienation during COVID. I wanted to just show Lucy Darling, who's a fantastic feminist performer. I think she's the next slide coming up, and this was work that I saw this piece. I participated in it. It was part of an event I put together with the PAC, which is the Niagara Performing Arts Center, and we did a multi-day kind of educational digital learning opportunity that looked at the digital transformation in general in the arts, and then also looked at the impacts of COVID. So it helped artists look at tools and organizations. And, in fact, in many ways, her performance became different, and one could even argue in her mind better, because it's it's an extremely funny, interactive, humorous, humor show where she pulls people out of the audience and she interacts with them, and she finds them, in a digital audience, and she can also, again, use mobile technologies to do that. Fall for Dance North, they did this festival this year. I attended that as well, the Flipped Festival. Small numbers of choreographers and dancers working in safe space, and then they streamed it. They also had Mambo, which was a fantastic podcast. They'd never done this before, and it all kind of worked. And then, just quickly, Taffel Music, which I think is my next slide, who've managed to really build out their audiences with a digital pass. And if you look at the data, and again, Nanos has been doing this work with Business for the Arts, yes, people want to go back to live, but yes, people also want to stay on digital. And a lot of arts organizations have found that they have a whole other group of people who are now their audiences, who cannot physically get to the theater, cannot physically get to the concert, cannot physically get to the exhibition. They're disabled, or they're older, or they're from another place. And Soul Pepper maybe is the last one, and it's the next slide. And, I'm going to this right now. It's around the world in 80 plays, and it's wonderful. And Soul Pepper has transformed itself, and it's really dealing with issues of race and cultural diversity, and it's keeping its actors engaged through, doing traditional, what would be radio plays, but as plays. So you can pull the slides down. So I just think there's been a kind of creativity that's been unleashed in this context that is really important to retain and needs support from, Heritage, Canada Council, et cetera. And that I think it's surprising to look at some of the demographic that's been able to actually participate and create in this context from home studios and home recording. And honestly, I'm not sure everybody who's an artist wants to go back to, that traditional way of working, nor do organizations. So I think our challenge is how to retain the real innovation that's happened. Because, I come from the new media art world, so does Elliot. A lot of this stuff has been happening in the new media world for like decades and decades. And now it's kind of propagated through performing arts and through visual arts. And I think it's a really exciting, positive lesson. So I wanted to give the kind of flip side of that. Recognizing that there are exclusions and there are challenges for sure, no question.
Yeah, Sarah, thank you so much for bringing the artist into the conversation. Really, sometimes they were left aside. So it's wonderful to speak about artists and digital transformation and the positive flip side, if we can call it that, of a horrible pandemic. Elliot, please join in.
Oh yeah, so much to say to that. Thank you, Sarah. That's really great. I actually want to continue talking about the artists that are doing this work. In particular, I want to just highlight a few of the Indigenous-led projects that are really exceptionally using technology and are exploring digital sovereignty. And again, we're talking about ways of using technology when we have these dispersed communities, right? So how to connect people across this huge span of land, right? So this is where we see Indigenous artists have actually led in new media art in this country. That has been the case forever, and it continues to be. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Aboriginal territories in cyberspace. I think Sarah, we talked about this before. So AbTech is a research creation network that was founded by Jason Lewis and Skawinati. So one of their projects that I really think is very interesting is called AbTech Island. So this is a indigenously determined location in Second Life, where we can go as the public, we can go and we can visit this space, and we can visit the gallery where they actually have these Second Life artworks that we can view. And I think that's a really, really interesting project. And they've been working for many years with these projects. And the second one I just want to quickly bring up is actually out here in the West. So it's the IM4 Media Lab. So this is a group of Indigenous matriarchs. So we've got Loretta Todd, Cease Weiss, Doreen Manuel, and Tracy Kim Bono. These are like really heavy hitters in the media arts world. And they've gotten together, and what they're doing is they're creating immersive learning and opportunities for an Indigenous tech ecosystem, which is so fabulous, and just bring in these Indigenous worldviews to how we are using tech and how we are using tech in arts and culture. And I think that, you know, I just have to say, like, using virtual and augmented reality as this platform for storytelling and sharing of this cultural knowledge is a very, very important use of technology that is happening right now. And I think that, you know, I guess I just want to quote Doreen just slightly, because she says such amazing things, that we're using this to recreate our reality and our Indigenous futures. And we are helping people to understand and experience this beautiful way of seeing the world, of seeing our world. So this is where we see that actually having the opportunity to have a really big shift of arts and culture to the digital platforms, it's a huge opportunity for us to actually access some of the work that's being done. And, you know, as Inga said earlier, we have replicated, like we have replicated our current realities and brought all of those problems and all of that bias, everything that's going on, we've just replicated it. And so how do we use art? And how do we use the data that we're collecting? And how do we use this technology? And where's, you know, working at that intersection to actually, you know, use art as a tool for civic engagement? How do we change society? And how do we see what changes are already happening? So how do we gather that data? I guess just to add one more point, how do we gather that data when so much is happening in a way that is not necessarily tracked and gathered? So the art market data, we used to be able to see and understand, well, we would assess the value of art through how things are sold in the art market. But now there are all these undocumented sales of art. So how do we look at this now?
If I can just add a couple of thoughts to this. Sarah, a lot of your examples, of course, came from Toronto, not exactly the margins of the world in our Canadian geography, but it reminded me of an extraordinary initiative that the Alyanate Arts Festival in Iqaluit, Nunavut took last fall. They usually do a summer festival, a week long. They bring an incredible array of Nunavut circumpolar and some southern artists together. They had to do this. They decided, despite Nunavut's data cap, to create a 2-day online festival. What was remarkable is they got 60,000 views on that in a population of 36,000, including all the little babies. So clearly the audience was there. But they also were able to, what they did, which was very different because there was no traveling, is they worked with every hamlet across the 25 communities in Nunavut, and they recruited an artist, and they worked with the hamlet, the local government, to create videos, high quality videos that they would feed into this 2.5 or 3 hour evening presentation. And all of a sudden, every single community in Nunavut could see itself inside this festival. One of the outcomes of this is I just worked with them on their upcoming strategic plan, and they are now deciding to become a festival that is Nunavut-wide. Something that is unfathomable. Nunavut is 1/5 of the territory of Canada. It's 2 million square kilometers. And connecting people in that place has been incredibly challenging. But there is that inadvertent, because we had to figure it out, we did, right? And that being able to overcome incredible challenges where you don't upload and download video in Nunavut. You put it on a plane. Right. So I thought that was remarkable. There are absolutely those standout experiences that we are seeing in the most unlikely of places, which I find super exciting.
I'm going to go to Sarah now, because that's a perfect segue to talk about like how we can find that diverse data. And just an aside, I sort of feel like when we're talking about art and artists, there's always a way. So that creative process, I have a sweatshirt where it's written, "My art will go on." And I just find that there's something about being in this community, being in the art and cultural community, that really allows a different way of thinking and maybe a motivation to change and to transform. So Sarah, I'm just going to go for you, and and finding that data to be able to look at the whole picture as opposed to just a segment of the picture.
So Inga, first of all, you're right. The examples I used were different scales of organizations and artists, and they were urban. I think your example was incredibly important. And there certainly are others, though, of success, big success stories. But I wanted to talk about some of the efforts that are underway that really have been in part, provoked by gaps in the kind of data that Telefilm, and I know that is sort of quasi-commercial film, and the Canadian Media Fund have. And I think, Elliot, you've been also part of some of that process where there's been a very deep discussion in the commercial funding agencies, but also now with the Canada Council. Jesse Wente is in the chair, and he's also the head of the Indigenous Screen Office, and with Joan Jenkinson, who heads the Black Screen Office. So there's been a really great, deep conversation about categories, because, when you're collecting data, you need to be able to build an ontology. So you need to understand what metadata connects to what metadata, and to collect in the right categories. So they've been looking at how to define the right categories for Black and Blackness in a Canadian context, how to define those in terms of Indigenous and people of color. And some of the initiatives that are really valuable are large-scale surveys. Canada Council has taken one that is primarily qualitative, but the Black Screen Office is going to be leading some very, very important data gathering to Black Canadians, asking them, what their cultural consumption habits are. And it's a large panel. The numbers are large in terms of the survey. And they're also looking at the producers, both, above the line, as they would say in the industries, and below the line, in terms of who is producing work. And the idea is to be able to link racialized producers, Indigenous producers, Black producers with the communities for whom they are in part creating work. It's not to say that you want a one-to-one relationship by any means there. So I think these initiatives to find the data are really, really important. And, there's opportunities to survey the art market as well. I think that's interesting, and to figure out how to scrape that data. So lots to say. I did want to say Artworks TO in Toronto, which is one of the outcomes of the work that we did on Rethinking Public Art. That event is about revitalizing. Now it's about revitalizing. It was supposed to be kicking off a 10-year public art strategy, but it totally follows what Elliot was talking about sort of taking back the public space. And the vast majority of artists in this in Artworks TO, which will launch in the fall now, are racialized, Indigenous, Black artists, different ages, disabled artists, and completely distributed over Toronto. And in the areas in Toronto which constitute areas that tend to be marginalized. And so the idea is to link public engagement, discourse about the city, this sort of reinvention of the city post-COVID, with an economic and social imperative. So I think you can put the two together sometimes.
For sure. Can I jump in there?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
I just want to jump in because you've touched on something that I think is also exceptionally important, which is audiences and who is going to consume this work and what work are they consuming, right? So the problem that we have, I think, with audience analytics is people want to see themselves reflected in the art. They want to see their experiences and their interests reflected. So there are many people who are not accessing what is out there right now because it isn't of interest to them, right? So this is where we also then need to look at the data of the presenters, right? What is in the museum, the gallery, what is on stage? And that's where we need to take that data, which is, of course, also collected. And that's where we can see those gaps. We can identify those gaps, and we can identify places where we can make some change to actually see better inclusion and access and what have you. So I will point out that one problem that sometimes we have, though, is transparency. So not everyone has access to that data that we need.
I think you're bringing up such important points with regards to artists, with regards to the data that we're collecting. It seems to go a little bit full circle back to this idea of why are we collecting this data and what is it for? We did sort of touch upon the economics of it, but I'm going to throw it over to Inga to take a deeper dive there, because, and then unbeknownst to us, time has flown by and we have just 10 minutes left. So after Inga, I'd like to go to just some closing thoughts so we have time to wrap up.
I'll speed it up.
No, it's okay. Take your time.
One of the major things that COVID has revealed to policymakers, artists always knew this to be true. Those of us who work in the arts or consult in the arts always knew this to be true. The precarity under which art is created in this country is absolutely mind-blowing. I'm a great fan of professional artists and professional art. I want the deepest thinkers to bring their perspectives to bear on our current realities. I don't get that when I read, the Financial Post, right? I get that when I go to theater, when I see performances. Some days my mind is blown, often it's not. But that's really where we have these incredibly trained people who I regard as, sort of the most profound thinkers about the human condition and the condition of Canada. We need to support them. We need to pay them for this work. They are philosophers. They are many, many things. They're creatives. They're innovators. We've invested tremendously, sometimes in the formal system, and people themselves and their communities in which they live have tremendous, investments, whether that's indigenous methodologies or whether that is racialized communities, people of color who work in this context, in this country, where they've had difficulty accessing the formal kind of supports, right? When I'm looking at, so now that we understand just how absolutely dire those individuals whose work we are consuming are living in the circumstances in which they live, we need to start to build things that support them, right? Why are we supporting arts organizations and administration of arts to a higher degree than artists? I think that's an important question we need to ask. Now, I'm not dissing the administrators. We need that. It's the imbalance that intrigues me. I think we also need to think about, so we're talking about the digital world, right? We're talking about data in the digital world. So how is it that we're going to begin to manage the rights of artists to their creative outputs in the digital realm? There is no good framework for this. It took everybody by surprise. There is no union contract that, despite the internet having been around since 1994, there is no union contract that adequately addresses rights management in the digital realm. We have seen an incredible amount of free provided by professional artists so that we can feel connected to each other through COVID, especially in the early phases. Free doesn't buy my groceries. It doesn't pay my rent as an artist. So we really need to rethink how we're investing, how we're creating policies that has been disadvantaging, in fact, the creation process to a large extent. And we need to sort of really think about, we have no trouble spending billions of dollars in annual subsidy to extraction industries. We're spending a few million federally in arts and culture, right? So there is also, I think, a need for us to recognize, when we're investing in old ways of being at such high rates, are we actually leaving, a lot of blank space for Canadian creativity and innovation untapped that would actually be far more sustainable moving forward post-COVID, looking at climate change, looking at, the evolution of the internet. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Inga. I see that Sarah just wants to touch on some more tools with regards to artists working with AI. So Sarah, please, love to hear more about that.
So, this is kind of builds on, I think, what Inga's saying too, though. And this is, I'll start with not an artist working with AI, but a company. And if you can throw up the Magnify slide, Rebecca, that would be great. So I think we have to actually support Canadian companies to build tools that are sensitive to issues of diversity and give arts organizations and screen industries and even artists, the means to kind of plan and manage their data. So they're not reliant on broadcasters. They're not reliant on, funders also to tell them what their data is. So this idea of sort of self-management and education and self-management, I think, is really important. I think the other thing that we need to do is support artists who are working critically with AI. And I think that's incredibly important. If you want to show Jareth Thorpe, I'd love to, because I work in visualization. I do it more now as an analyst than as an artist. But there are artists like Jareth, and I want to really promote visualization as another set of tools, because we need to interpret data in ways that are really accessible, really meaningful, and available across different sectors of society to do the kind of work that Elliot was talking about, which is understanding, for example, the content that people are showing. So this is just a great project by Jareth. He's a Canadian visualization artist, maybe one of the best in the world right now. And this work just looks at immigration patterns. It's beautiful. 2017, at the height of the Trump, sort of shut down of immigration to the US. It looks at all the places people came to make New York the city that it is. So I think we need to invest in tool building and artists doing critical work in this space. And I guess I think on the policy side, we have to really look at, what is a living wage for artists? Is there a way of looking at the kind of systems in Europe where artists are funded, whether or not they're producing at that moment or not? Everything we do is project-based, whether it's the screen industries, commercial industries, or whether it's artists. And we need to, arts organizations aren't project funded, but, it's really a fundamental crisis that we have, that artists are not yet given a living wage. I think the last commission, and I sat on it when I was like a wee artist, was like in the 1980s, looking at those questions. And we're still at a point where that's not happening. So we need some really strong advocacy here to value the artist and their critical role, their transformative role in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
You're here. Sarah. Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that just to also connect those two, right? Valuing the arts and the role of the arts to the data and the data that we need to prove that point. Because I believe we already know, right? Like, if you ask people, is arts and culture, is that critical? It is, right? But why isn't that reflected? I don't see that reflected in Canada in the way that we see it in other countries, right? Arts and culture is part of infrastructure. It's essential. There are supports, right? And I'm excited that we are talking about universal basic income seriously, perhaps. I don't know if that's me being naive, but it feels like we're seriously talking about that right now. And that will change the arts sector hugely, and how artists are able to work and live, and who gets to be an artist. And I think that that's really, really important to where we're going. I think I'd also just like to quickly touch on this idea of, we need to break down these silos between the sectors. And some of this is already going on, right? Like, we see a lot of research going on with arts and technology, arts and medical science. I think that's a really important one. We're using that data, right? Like, particularly that medical data, right? We're using that. We are using that to put artists into hospitals, into senior spaces, into vulnerable communities. We are seeing the effect of that now, but we need that research to back it, right? And the artists need to be involved. So I guess I will close that on the need for artists to be involved in things such as AI ethics, right? And creating those frameworks and changing and adapting those frameworks as we go. Valentine Godard is someone doing a huge amount of work in this, right? She's an artist and lawyer looking at AI ethics and social impact. So, you know, she talks about that need for the arts sector to be involved in those conversations, right? And again, art as a tool for civic engagement. Art helps us to understand and to think about and talk about and communicate about our world and society, right? And so it is really essential that we are looking at the bias that is inherent in AI. We are looking at these things, we're thinking about these things, and we are doing that in arts and culture, right? The same as it is happening in every other sector. So we need to talk to each other, I think, that is a piece that I'd like to see immediately. Let's break those silos. Let's come to the same table.
Yeah, and it's such a universal language, really, I think. We're running out of time. We just have a couple of more minutes extended from our period because this conversation is so good. And I'd like to close on just some thoughts, and we've already touched upon this, but maybe we can do in one short sentence. If we were able to imagine a kind of shift that would happen in Canadian society in order to see arts and culture, the value of arts and culture as it should be, what would that shift look like? So one sentence, two sentences maybe is very hard, I know. But really, because we have this wonderful opportunity today to bring forth to Canadians and to the government, like those shifts and those changes that you as experts on this panel of arts and data in Canada would like to see. So I'd like to close on that. I'll have Inga. Is that okay, Inga? Are you ready to do like two short sentences?
Well, it'll work to my favor that I'm German, and German sentences are very long with many commas.
Okay, French also.
French also. I think from a policy standpoint, there's so many angles. Both Elliot and Sarah will have things to say. I think a lot of my work recently has focused on platform ownership. I think we need to begin to understand that if creators are using Facebook and YouTube, that's great from an access to the art standpoint. It is absolutely horrendous from a sustainability and viability of the arts in Canada standpoint. So there's two projects I'm involved in. One is building a business-to-business application generated within the art sector to help performing artists showcase to buyers of performing arts. There is another project coming out of Alberta that I sometimes consult on called the Public Place Network that is designed in such a way to advantage not the platform owner who's a filmmaker out of Alberta, but to advantage the artists whose work will be on that platform, and the content owners should be getting the majority of revenue that they may choose to generate on that kind of platform. There's other initiatives that have been going on to help us own the data of the arts. One of them is artsdata.ca, which is spearheaded by Culture Creates in a very large partnership. Another one is the work that Muriel Marshall is doing. She's a theater artist. She's part of the Blue Mouth group normally, except now she's leading a W3C working group around performing arts information and trying to sort of create infrastructure as part of that whole ownership pitch, to create the infrastructure needed to actually have the fields, the pieces of information we want to collect in the performing arts specifically. That whole arena needs ongoing continuous support. It is true infrastructure in the same way that a theater stage is. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Inga, so much for that. And really that ownership of digital platforms and ownership of data, of information, right? Because knowledge, well, I'll repeat it, knowledge is power. Art can definitely do with a little bit more brawn within Canadian society. Sarah, would you be open to doing your last thoughts on this?
Yeah, I want to build on some things that Elliot had said earlier, and also to kind of laud some of Inga's comments. So, I think this idea of multi-factor data set collection and correlations between the arts itself, but also the arts in relationship to impact and in relationship to potential impact and dissemination. I think that work is incredibly important. And I think it's, both an academic space, but also one for people who work in policy analysis like Inga. I guess I've seen a lot of money invested by Heritage, or reasonable money by Canada Council, Heritage, the screen industry organizations in supporting the collection of data. And what I really don't see is a unified, clear, collaborative approach. Synapse in Quebec has done a phenomenal job with the collection of data there. So part of why we created Data Ecoculture was to really try and bring that conversation together. And I think investment is needed there. And I think it's great that there's platforms. They all need to work together. It's really critical that we create these data sets, we figure out what's open, we look at how people access them, we look at how to support it through maybe service fees or whatever, if there's a group of people running that access. But we need the data, and then we can build the correlations. And we also need Stats Canada to invest more money, more effort in this correlation and this data collection effort, so they can work with Heritage Canada to help to poll and pull the data together that we need to do this kind of analysis. So I'm kind of staying on the data side. I said other policy things earlier. I mean, I think it's interesting to look at the large international platforms in Canada and maybe treat them the same ways that we do with other large strategic companies in Canada, which is to say, if you want to operate in this country, that you do pay a business tax of some kind. I don't think that's folly, but you also have to figure out how to do that and make sure that, I do think artists still need to access those platforms. So there you go. It's a lot. Policy is a big one, and we just are touching on it.
Yes, and I so wish that we had another 2 hours to discuss this, and I'm going to watch this afterwards to make sure that I get what I missed while I was asking questions. Elliot, last thoughts, please.
Sure. Well, we're talking about shifting the perception of the arts and the value of the arts, and I think that's happening. And I think we have a real opportunity right now. Arts and culture is the hardest hit sector with this pandemic, but it's also one of the sectors that we've drawn on the most as a society, right? So I do feel that people are understanding the need for arts and culture to exist and to be sustainable. And I think that a piece that we need to be mindful of, right, is that artists need to make art. And if we put too much back on the artist, then we're going to have a problem, right? We need new models. We need new platforms. We need new financial models. We need new supports, and we need to think through all of that and get it in place really quickly, because the artists are starving, and it's not a joke, and it's happening a lot more now. That pandemic hit, and we lost a lot of artists and a lot of cultural workers. And we need to deal with that.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I see in the chat there's yes, here. Thank you, Elliot, for bringing up that very, very important point and bringing the artist back into the conversation. I think we all come from a creative background, so happy to have that conversation sort of enfold everybody. I have to say that this was one amazing conversation and so rich in so many ways. I didn't think we would be able to get through all of these questions, but you all did a fabulous job of opening up that black box and bringing forth what is today in the context of the pandemic, but really the vision of the future of what art and culture could be. So thank you very, very much. And hopefully we'll have another conversation like this, because it's so successful, and we'll be able to pull you in again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'd love to have a part 2. There's so much more. I have questions I'd like to ask Inga and Sarah, right? There's so much more to talk about.
It was delightful. Thanks,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.